Good morning and thank you for coming along today. I want to start off by acknowledging traditional owners of the lands on which we meet and pay my respect to their elders past and present. I'd also particularly like to acknowledge those First Nation individuals who have contributed to the defence of Australia in times of both peace and war. My name, for those that don't know me, is Sally, and I'm roughly about halfway through my PhD, and I'm doing my PhD with Kirsten, Alex, and Vince. My topic of interest is high reliability followership and behaviour in elite military teams, the role of identity leadership and shared social identity content. I plan to spend the next 20-ish minutes talking to you about one of my studies and the preliminary findings which I'm in the process of writing up. So the scope, I'm really going to very quickly cover the theoretical framework because I assume most people in the room have at least a working knowledge of HRO and social identity content. I then will go social identity theory. I'll then go on to talk about a qual study and that I've carried out and also my findings. And then if I've got time at the end, I'm going to do a really quick case study. So high reliability organisations. In the 1980s, there was a group of researchers at Berkeley who started conducting research on 3 organisations, in particular air traffic control area control centres, US Navy aircraft carriers, and an electric company. The focus on these organisations wasn't random. They recognised that these 3 organisations deliver output and they do it pretty much error-free. So high reliability organisations then are organisations where catastrophic events should happen, but don't. This work was subsequently built on developing the idea of the collective mind, and they did this through observations on how individuals on US Navy aircraft carrier flight decks interrelate to enable the smooth takeoff and landing of aircraft. The collective mind is how that team interrelate. It's a complex adaptive system tied together by trust. And this is how the HRO succeeds. It is the team interrelating and working together towards a shared goal. The construct of collective mindfulness involves 5 interdependent sub-processes or behaviours. And these are preoccupation with failure, which is recognising all failures as problematic for the organisation and working to eliminate all negative effects, a reluctance to simplify, so digging below the surface to engage appropriately with the breadth and depth of matters, a sensitivity to operations, which I kind of think of as a situational awareness, like a big picture collectiveness, so understanding what's going on in the organisation and the activities that are going on around you. Commitment to resilience, so motivated to ensure that organisations are not disabled by any failures, and a deference to expertise, ensuring those most qualified to provide output are able and empowered to do so. So social identity is a cognitive mechanism which influences group behaviour, the idea that there is a shift in our perception from a personal to a social identity. Traditionally in the military, we like to think about leaders, but social identity theorists have challenged the very individualistic emphasis that the military tends to have. Instead, they emphasise the importance of the group, and in particular followership and the mobilisation of followers as indicators for effective leadership. However, what actually makes a leader effective? And remember, effective is not necessarily good. Within identity leadership theory, 4 aspects have been identified that need to be integrated together for effective leadership. Leaders need to not only be representative of the group, but be seen by the group to be representative. They need to advance the interests and be seen by the group to advance the interests of the group, and it's moulded and the group is moulded and cultivated by the leader, and in reality is interpreted in the image of group identity. Importantly, these aspects need to be present and continue to be present to ensure effectiveness over time. For example, a leader can be of the group but fail to advance the goals of the group, or they can fall into the leadership trap of believing themselves above the group. So this is the social identity model of high reliability organisations. Most of the HRO theorising to date has concentrated on what constitutes an HRO. It's largely focused on being very descriptive and centred on developing procedures and tools to see if organisations are actually HROs. What I want to try and do is understand why and how military behaviour is, for the most part, highly reliable. I want to emphasise, though, like effective leadership, highly reliable behaviour is not necessarily good. It's not necessarily moral or ethical. So how does the military organisation create elite teams that are able to pretty much consistently achieve tasks with near perfect accuracy? How is the organisation able to sustain this over many years, even when the changeover of personnel happens every 2 to 3 years? So in particular, I'm going to focus on step one. And this study that I'll be talking about today aims to assess social identity in the present. Do participants define themselves as members of a collective? And if so, do they internalise norms? And do these norms support the principles of HRO? What is the strength, alignment, content, and integration of these groups into the wider organisation? So now I'm just going to start talking about the research. So how do members of military organisations experience and engage in high reliability fellowship? This study involved semi-structured interviews with members of Air Combat Group or individuals who have been part of Air Combat Group during their military career. Now, Air Combat Group, so ACG, is the group within the RAAF, the Australian Air Force, that's responsible for fast jet combat operations. So I'm thinking about F-35 aircraft, I'm thinking Super Hornets and Growlers, plus the training of those aircrew. Aircrew were recruited via emails and snowballing occurred naturally. The participant pool was expanded to include combat controllers for generalisability. Combat controllers are individuals who are specially selected, trained and equipped to lead and direct military aircraft during combat operations and support of special forces. 25 interviews were completed. 2 of the interviewees were women, and the participants were actually given a choice about the event they discussed in the interview. We did give suggestions in the email we sent out. We said you could talk about potentially a blue on blue in peacetime or a training scenario, or you could talk about an event involving a difficult decision whilst on ops. So blue on blue is a Western military term that describes when blue or friendly forces accidentally harms other blue forces. So basically you are harming your own or allied forces with your attack. A difficult decision was purposefully not defined. If the participant tried to press me to say, well, what do you mean by a difficult decision? I turned it back on them and just said any event that you think was difficult. I did this to ensure the participants were able to discuss events that really mattered to them, and they weren't limited by my own experiences and views on what constitutes difficult. The 2 focuses, peacetime and operations, represent 2 very distinct contexts: a stable or relatively stable environment and a volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous one. One of the issues with the research is that I knew 20 out of the 24 participants personally, which gave us a very unique insider viewpoint. So the good things about this insider viewpoint is that it allowed for the free flow of conversation in interviews, as the participants and I, we talk the same language. Like most organisations, the military has a specific language members use to describe the reality or their reality. They didn't have to explain the nuances, the military-specific nuances, and they also didn't have to explain the context. Secondly, it gave our data a richness of insight. I was seen by the participants as one of them. I was part of their in-group, even if we were not personally known to each other. The participants likely had an expectation that the experiences they described were ones that I either had first-hand knowledge or experience of, or I was able to understand as an in-group member. Interestingly, with those interviewees that I didn't know that well or not at all, we spent some time at the beginning of the interviews and during, in some instances, building our credibility with each other. I found interviewees asking me questions about what aircraft I've flown and what campaigns I have been in. And I found myself, particularly with the combat controllers, name dropping special forces guys that I've either worked with in the past or that I know personally. So it was only once I started coding the transcripts that I realized that we carried out this kind of chimp grooming behavior with each other. And we all did it when we didn't know each other that well. So I took a critical realism stance and conducted thematic content analysis in 3 phases. The first phase consisted of repeated and active reading of the transcripts using a mixed deductive and inductive approach. Codes were both researcher generated and based on preparatory work that we carried out with social identity, identity leadership, and HRO theorizing, and they were also data derived. So they represented interesting things that came out of the data set. In the second phase, I used the initial code list to enable patterns and themes in the data set to be identified and organized into loose categories. We then went through a process of merging and breaking down the categories, and we went through this quite a few times. The third phase was the building of connection and interactions between the categories. We worked together to refine and define each category, and then I organised the categories into a coherent narrative which fitted into the broader overall story of the data. It's this that I want to share with you today for feedback and comments. So as we go through the findings, I'm going to be flashing up quite a lot of quotes. Please don't feel like you have to read them all. If you want to, we can go back and look at them afterwards, but I will read out maybe one from each page. So, early in the coding process, it was apparent that participants feel a really strong sense of identity, and this became an overarching theme, the strength and alignment of the shared military identity. This shared identity was a thread that ran through all of the participants' narrative. These are some of the quotes from the transcripts, but what was really interesting, we found it super interesting, was that when asked, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you identify with the group? 91% of participants rated themselves as 8 or above, and 23% of them rated themselves as off the scale. So 10 or above, actually not even a 10, above 10. Interestingly, this shared identity was not limited to individuals who the participants shared a work identity with. So either pilot, WISO stands for Weapon System Operator, so it's a navigator who sits in the aircraft with the pilot, or combat controller. The shared identity was able to expand or compress to fit around those that the participant believed had the same goals. In several instances, participants expanded the group boundary to include other military groups. For example, combat controllers saw themselves as having a lot of values and behaviours that were very similar to fast jet aircrew, and both aircrew and combat controllers saw links between their groups and other elite military teams, for example, special forces. 5 additional themes emerged from the interviews, these being engaging with ambiguity, tending to failure, proffering of expertise, a commitment to perseverance, and a sensitivity to purpose. These emergent categories are action responses by the individuals to the principles of HRO. And that was the 5 behaviours that we showed at the beginning. What I mean by that is that each action response is internalised as a shared social identity of the group. And the action response defines how members of the group practically respond to each HRO principle, thereby achieving near perfect task completion. In this slide, you can see on the left-hand side, the HRO principles with the definitions taken from Haslam and colleagues' recent paper in Safety Science. So what we've put on the right 2 columns is the action responses, which represent the practices of high reliability followership. These practices form the basis of the shared social identity content of the group. High reliability followership is the internalized shared social identity content manifesting in group members as engaged followership and behavior in direct response to the practicalities of the HRO principles. It's the combination of engaged followership and an internalized set of shared behaviors which defines how the group achieves the near perfect task completion. What we found, though, through the processes of coding, is that these themes or practices were constituted of sub-themes. And these sub-themes contextualize the group's shared social identity into practical behaviours that the group members participate in to achieve the group action in response to the principles of HRO. These behaviours are seen by the participants as normal group behaviours. They are what we do and how we behave. And I'm now just going to break those down and give you some quotes. So engaging with ambiguity is a practical response to the HRO principle, reluctance to simplify. It's made up of 3 subcategories: recognising inevitable uncertainty, reducing ambiguity, and training for unknown unknowns. So, quote, anything you can do to take out some unknown, that's your responsibility if you are a serious operator. You don't just let things happen to you. Next is attending to failure, which is a practical response to the HRO principle, preoccupation with failure. And these encompass the subcategories: a responsibility to improve, honest self-appraisal, and a motivated fact-finding. Quote, no mission is perfect. If you go out there and do a perfect mission, you just didn't find the thing you can improve on effectively. The HRO principle, commitment to resilience, has a practical group response, commitment to perseverance, which is made up of taking stock and moving on, commitment to debriefs, and nursing collective wounds. Quote, I think we all agreed in the end it was the right call, although we upset the JTAC, and it did result in us ultimately letting these guys get away to some extent. Proffering of expertise is a practical response to the HRO principle, deference to expertise. It's made up again of 3 subcategories: knowing our own limitations, maintaining credibility, and experience over hierarchy. Quote, it's not tied to rank, it's not tied to age, it's not necessarily tied to experience, but it's almost tied to proficiency in that moment. And lastly, sensitivity to purpose is a practical response to the HRO principle, sensitivity to operations. And this encompasses a clear task focus, owning the purpose, and commitment to excellence. Quote, the team output, that's the most important thing. Everything else was noise and getting it done. So that's the model. So what about identity leadership? Well, I'm actually still in the process of writing this part up, but my initial thoughts as I've been going through the data is that it comes down to leaderful leadership. Positional authority in the hierarchical structure has limited influence. The group are quick to eject those positional leaders who fail to uphold the shared identity of the group. And it is those who are able to embed and cultivate the shared identity that seem to kind of like phoenix out as the leaderful leaders within the group. So I'm just going to go on to the case study. So I got asked to put together a case study for a non-academic audience, which included some military types. I thought I'd share it with you, or what I have so far, to see if any of you can help me make it better. And not wanting to anger my military audience too much, I decided not to use a real life scenario. Instead, I chose okay, yeah, it's a bit silly and a little bit predictable, but hopefully it will work. So we have this team, and interestingly, there's some research out there about HRO that a 2-ship aircraft represents a micro HRO. But anyway, I digress. So you have these teams. They are a team on the Top Gun course. Neither can pass on their own. They need to work together to get through, and they need to work with the rest of the course to pass too. It is a group activity to pass a course like this. They have a shared identity of work hard, play hard, complete the mission, and a mutual love of volleyball. Thing is, Clue is in his call sign. Maverick is not following the rules of the group. Iceman tells him, Maverick, it's not your flying, it's your attitude. The enemy's dangerous, but right now you're worse. Dangerous and foolish, you may not like who's flying with you, but whose side are you on? And then Goose dies. Although not quite the same, this is a quote from one of the participants of my study. Fratricide, shooting your lead or shooting your wingman or shooting your friendly is, if you like, probably one of the worst things you can do. That's worse than getting shot by a bad guy. Having your lead or wingman blow up because a bad guy shot you is very bad, but shooting your lead and wingman and therefore killing your lead or wingman is probably 10 times worse. And Maverick, through his actions, has killed his teammate. The group still accepts Maverick. He is, after all, the ultimate fighter pilot, but he is no longer one of them. Interestingly, notice it is Iceman who is leading the team's acceptance of Maverick. So this is all confirmed in Top Gun 2. Maverick is living alone with an airplane in his garage. Yeah. He has previously to this, he was a Top Gun instructor, but he only lasted 1 month. And he hasn't been on a squadron for years. He's a test pilot, the only pilot on the project that he is working on. And through his egotistical actions, the project is cancelled, thereby destroying the team. This is reinforced when he enters the Top Gun bar, and none of the best pilots and aircrew in the US Navy even know who he is. Hangman calls him an old man, even though his name is clearly written on his jacket. There is no recognition of who or what he is. He is not one of them. He ends up getting thrown out of the bar for not following group norms. This is reiterated when his exploits have to be read out to the team when he's introduced to them the next day. This is in contrast to Iceman. Iceman has spent his career honing his identity leadership. He represents, advances, cultivates, and embeds a shared identity amongst them. He has done this to such a great effect that he has built up enough credits within his team that when he decides he wants Maverick to come back and teach, they accept Maverick back, even though they don't want to. They trust Iceman that much. Maverick, he starts acting like a bit of a tool in the air-to-air phase. And if you want me to list the reasons, we can talk about that later. Maverick only starts to get accepted by the team when he shows them what he actually can do, but not in a flashy, I'll kick your ass type of way. He flies the route of the mission within the time. He creates the team understanding that what they are being asked to do is achievable. He embeds the team mentality with the football playing on the beach. They are no longer a disparate group. They're now working together. But in typical Maverick style, he almost ruins it until he gets the talk from Penny. Those are your pilots. If anything happens to them, you will never forgive yourself. And Maverick redeems himself to the group. Task completed successfully, 4 enemy aircraft destroyed, a stolen Tonga, and back to the carrier for tea and medals. Okay. So that concludes my talk. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'd really like to hear any feedback and suggestions. And obviously, of course, I'm happy for questions.